Science is the great antidote to the poison of enthusiasm and superstition. Hi, I'm Juliette Sellgren, and this is my podcast, The Great Antidote, named for Adam Smith, brought to you by Liberty Fund. To learn more, visit www.adamsmithworks.org. Welcome back. If you remember anything from mandatory government class from when you were in like high school, you might remember learning about DC, at least maybe me because I'm in Northern Virginia, right, bordering on DC. Maybe we just specifically learned about this, but the District of Columbia has one representative in Congress and they don't get to vote. Then how on earth does anything government related get done in DC, you might ask? I kind of had no idea. So today, on April 14th, 2023, I'm excited and honored to be talking to Yesim Sayin about this and more. She's the executive director and the founder of the DC Policy Center, which is a non-partisan independent think tank that produces research and analysis on everything policy in DC. I have known her my entire life, so it's really awesome that we get to be doing this today. Welcome.
Thank you, Juliette. It's so good to be with you. Thank you.
So before we get started, I'm curious about this. What is the most important thing that people my age or in my generation should know that we don't?
Well, I thought deeply about this question. I didn't know what to say, but then I figured out that I will say the following. No matter what you think you will do in the future, you'll probably be in the business of sales. So be ready.
What do you mean? What do you mean? What if I'm an academic? Am I going to be selling things?
You'll be selling like there is no tomorrow. You'll be selling as you interview for your job. You'll be selling as you're trying to get your tenure. If you're going for grants, you'll be selling. And the better salesman you are, the more likely your content is important, but your salesmanship will make the difference.
That's a good point. And here I was thinking I could get away with not having a good elevator pitch for the podcast or myself or anything because I just work with ideas which are long-winded. I guess I was wrong.
Yeah, it took me a long time to internalize this or even accept it because I was thinking, what do you mean? My ideas are great. Here's my term paper. It should be good. But the world doesn't work that way.
Yeah, I guess especially with the decrease in attention spans, it's becoming more and more important. So this is a very good piece of advice. All right. So good. Before we get into the DC Policy Center, it's important to understand DC itself because it's a very unique place. So I don't know, what's so special about DC and how does it function differently from state governments or even other localities?
I figured this out myself in 2006 when I started working for the DC government. I had no idea. I thought it was like this dysfunctional place. And I was thinking, I'll get a couple of years of experience here and go to IMF or somewhere like this. DC is truly unique. It is a state government, a local government, a school district, all of these things combined. And it's run by a mayor and a council, the size with 13 council members. So all the policies that are split between state and local level governments in other states are combined in the District of Columbia. For example, in Virginia, Arlington County does schools, firefighters, police, trash collection. And then Richmond does health policy, human services, transportation, all these things. And similarly, on the revenue side, Arlington County will collect the property taxes, traffic fines and things like this, parking revenue. But then it's Richmond that collects the sales taxes, the income taxes, estate taxes, gross receipt taxes, business taxes, all of that stuff. In DC, all of these things are combined, concentrated, and there is one mayor and 13 council members that make decisions over this. I think the advantage of a system like this is you truly see the connections between different policy areas. Your housing policy is your education policy. Your transportation policy is your housing policy. And in most places, those things don't play well together. And they're always different localities arguing with each other and the state level government to get things right. In DC, there's a great opportunity to align them. I'm not saying it happens, but there is more of an opportunity, and it gives us to think about these issues from sort of like this unique urban perspective, but a whole many different facets that we can think together. Similarly, on the revenue side, the district's revenue regime is arguably more resilient because we have both the state and local taxes combined. So you have a more diversified set of revenue tools. That is a big advantage.
It's interesting because I took a public choice class last semester, and we talk a lot about the different ways that state governments work and local governments and how they kind of compete with each other in different ways because their powers are intertwined but also dependent on one another.
That's
like
right.
The federal government can impose certain rules, and I mean that's almost definitely the case in DC too, but it's almost as though this combining of the state and local government might allow DC to function more in unison or to make more progress. I don't know if I want to say progress, but does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it does. And one way to think about it is you have more levers to pull and push, so you can create better policies by combining things that you won't be able to do when the state and local government functions are separated. So that's a big advantage in my mind. And it makes it fun to work on DC because you got all these policy areas that you can focus on.
Well, so I hear creative and efficient government policy, and I get a little skeptical, I'm not going to lie. Do we really want government able to create and pull levers in a flash? Not always. So the DC Policy Center, what is it? How is it created and why? And how does it help this process of policy creation? I know that's a big question.
Yeah, I'm in the business of sales. I'll just sell it to you right now. And we were created almost 7 years ago. And it's really interesting because in 2014, there was a tax revision commission in the District of Columbia that was led by the former mayor, Anthony Williams. And the tax revision commission had a bunch of people representing various aspects of business interests, progressives, advocacy organizations, and things like that. It was really interesting to watch it because there's sort of like a contingency of business interests, businessmen, and advocacy groups for business. And there was this one guy, Ed Lazier, who used to run a single progressive organization called the DC Fiscal Policy Institute. And Ed would come to these meetings with tons of papers under his arm and make these arguments. If you increase taxes, people will not move away, businesses will not respond to tax rates and things like that. And as you know, that if you're looking for an argument to support your point of view in the economic research, area, you'll find it. You can ignore those that don't, but he found them and he showed up. And that really, and the comeback from the business community was just anecdotes. And they're like, I have a friend who lives here and they told me that they're going to move. And, this is sort of silly discourse, right? We shouldn't be having policy conversations like this, either being kind of selective in the types of academic research we bring to the table or kind of mixed academic research with advocacy research that can be very different. And I'm trying to counter that with anecdotes. So at the end of that, I was working at the DC government at that time in the office that does the revenue estimates for the city and fiscal notes, basically what the Congressional Budget Office does and the Joint Committee on Taxation does for the federal government. So I was responsible for those fiscal notes. And at the end of this process, Tony Williams approached me and asked if I would be willing to start a think tank to counter the fake news. Now, I love that because this other guy I mentioned is a really good friend of mine, and he's very passionate, and he was very successful in changing policy because he was persuasive, and there wasn't a whole lot of counter research. So that's the genesis of the DC Policy Center. It was incubated in the civic organization called the Federal City Council that dates back, 50, 60 years. But within a year, we separated and became independent. And, the work that we do is trying to arm decision makers with reliable research to improve policy and, importantly, policy discourse. And it is hard work. Sometimes I think of the work we do as essentially legislative subsidy. Politicians will take research if it supports their position and may reject it if it doesn't. But what we have learned through the process is constantly producing reliable, high-quality, data-driven work eventually builds up a sort of following of its own. So over time, our work has become more and more prominent. The more heavily used it becomes, the more the politicians, elected officials pay attention to it. And we have one single rule at the DC Policy Center when it comes to the type of research that we do, is that it cannot be an I believe type of article. It has to be something like, say something new and say it with data. So we're very data driven. I wouldn't want to say that we don't have any bias. Everybody brings their own biases to the table. But we try to be as objective as we can be.
That's awesome. When I was preparing for the interview, I kept thinking about the 50 states, they're laboratories of democracy. America is this great experiment where each state, each locality kind of does their own thing, where states can engineer creative policy ideas that are tested within the state and then sometimes adopted at the federal level, discarded at the state level. Whatever happens, happens. But DC is not a state. And as you mentioned, the DC Policy Center kind of plays a unique role that other think tanks don't. So I guess, how is the DC Policy Center different from other think tanks, either federally focused think tanks or state level think tanks?
The political environment is one thing. So as I mentioned, it is a vast portfolio and it is a big budget. It's hard to make comparisons, but because we're combining state and local functions, our annual budget is like $19 billion. It's a lot of money. And there are 13 council members and one mayor. And so it's very easy to have the 7 to pass things. That's good for good policy design. And it's bad when the policy design is bad. So we're operating in this environment where our influence can be great with much less work than other think tanks or advocacy organizations will have to put in. But the competition is also tough. I think that any think tank has one leg sort of in research, another leg in advocacy. And they kind of mix this at different levels. Like some of them are very strong in research, but they're not particularly strong on the Hill or in the state houses or, state legislative offices. Others are very strong on advocacy, but they're not really particularly strong on research. I think we are trying to lean on both feet equally. So we're very strong on research, and our advocacy work is not traditional advocacy work. It's more intervention before even the legislation is written. So we work with the mayor and the council members essentially before the pen hits the paper, and trying to kind of give them ideas, work with them in developing their ideas. We are also good at combining different data sets to produce new information, and that has allowed us to really come up with innovative ideas. For example, I can give some examples if you want, but I don't know if you do.
Yeah, that would be great. I was about to ask.
Yeah, we worked on a lot of things. One or two things that really stand out to me. For example, in the area of housing, when states and localities put money in affordable housing, they do it in the most expensive way possible, which is to build new affordable housing. For example, in the District of Columbia, there's this thing called the Housing Production Trust Fund. That money goes to capital subsidies, and then developers will mix it with other federal credits or federal incentives to build affordable housing. Invariably, these things will cost $600,000 or $700,000 per unit, and they will invariably be concentrated in parts of the city that are far away from opportunity, because there are other parts of the city where building is either impossible because of zoning or very expensive. So none of these subsidies are sufficient. So we build a model that basically focuses on preservation because it's much cheaper, right? And the model relied upon the government working with landlords from different buildings in highly resourced parts of the neighborhoods of the city. And every building, if the owner desires to do so, so it's a voluntary program, they will put maybe 5 or 10 units in their buildings under affordability covenants. And then the government will give them a one-time cash infusion that's the equivalent of the market rent and this affordable rent through the period of this affordability. If you do this, and if you do this especially in rent-controlled buildings where rents are already suppressed below market rates, but as you know, at least, I should tell you that in DC, rent control is not income tested. So there are lots of people who live there who have, two professionals that they're not, and rent control is not meant to be an affordability program. It's a price stabilization program. But we found out that if we were to do this, we can create an affordable unit that is, for example, around the zoo in wards 2 or 3. These are highly resourced parts of the city with proximity to good schools, good transportation, high quality retail, job centers. We can produce the same unit for about $100,000. So that's a huge discounted price on creating affordability. So the city has adopted this right now, and it's a part of the affordability tools and increasingly using that because cities and localities and state governments are going through an incredibly difficult fiscal period right now. During the first 2 years of COVID, all this kind of federal money rained from the skies. At the same time, cities like DC, San Francisco, LA, New York, which are very dependent on commuter activity and office demand, their finances started unraveling. For 2 years, those funds from the federal government kept these governments afloat and growing. And this is the first year where there's no money. So all of these creative ideas, things that nobody wanted to touch in the past, like third rail, sacrosanct stuff, it's all now possible. And we've been looking at those issues, and now we're putting these proposals that were not previously possible, but now attractive. But that housing idea is one that I'm particularly proud of. It has attracted lots of national interest. We're developing a private sector version of it right now with no government subsidies whatsoever. And to me, that's a lot of fun to work on. And now you can see the impact right away.
Yeah, it seems almost as though because you guys are so localized that the causes and effects are much more clear and much more directly felt. So if something doesn't work, then you know, or you even there are more stakeholders in the process. And so it's almost that much more important to get it right. Have you observed this, or am I just kind of pulling this out of thin air?
I would say this, that the state and local governments, especially local governments, is where the rubber hits the road. And the impacts of the government's actions are felt immediately and very, very sort of like, you can't really deny it. So when we closed the schools for a year in DC in response to COVID, we lost 5 or 6 years of learning improvements. When you cut, for example, TANF support, you see an increase in homelessness. So you are right that the cause and effect, I wouldn't say it's cause and effect, but the government's actions have immediate and profound impact on people's lives. And to me, it was an eye-opener working on the District of Columbia. Again, we are lucky to be doing this work in DC because of this sort of like unified ownership over different issue areas. I think the federal government feels further away from me, at least. And for most large states, the state government is really further away from rural areas or, exurban areas. But DC is very condensed, very small, and very much a government town. I mean, the government is in the lives of everyone. And when you think about it, you sit on a park bench, it's government. You're walking on the street, it's government. You're, sending your kid to school. If it's not a private school, it's government. You're taking a bus, it's government. So it's, and in cities, that's like even more obvious because infrastructure is so important. Public safety is so important. Public health is so important. So the role of the government, in my mind, is amplified and undeniably important.
And I want to get into some of those areas, but first, I kind of want to ask you this maybe weird question of what is one of the coolest things that you've learned about DC that people might not know if they haven't had your experience or spent as much time as you working in DC?
I learned a lot. I learned that if you come to DC government as a libertarian like me, you'll end up being slightly progressive. And that if you come to the DC government as a progressive, you end up being an anarchist because as you read through like some of the laws that we have passed, some of them are ridiculous. For example, if you want to dance for longer than 2 days on the street in DC, you need a special permit from the mayor. I learned that. I learned that through the history of the District of Columbia since its beginning, its relationships with the federal government changed maybe over 6 or 7 times in terms of fiscal relationships. And that was never sort of like done with the DC residents' interests in heart. That was interesting. I learned that half the kids go to charter schools in DC, and there's a great deal of choice, which makes the relationship between housing prices and school quality weaker. That to me was a very welcome surprise.
So, I mean, let's follow this charter schools thread. That's a lot, right? I mean, and
that's pretty big, yeah. I was in New Orleans. I don't believe that there's another city with such a large share of charter school students.
Well, so I guess what has allowed DC to do that, and how successful has it been, and how have you guys worked on that, and what are you guys doing with respect to that right now?
Yeah, I mean, we have a whole initiative on education. May I share another thing that I learned about a few weeks ago that blew my mind? And then I'll answer this question. 47% of white kids in the District of Columbia who are high school age go to one single high school.
What? Wow.
Whoa, that is so wild.
And there are a lot of schools in DC.
Yeah, there are like 7, 8 high schools. There are actually more than that. So we work a lot on education. Our focus on education is through this urban lens. We're most interested in how schools work in terms of attracting families or pushing families out, and how they create opportunities for the district's youth. One of the things that we have looked at is the life outcomes of districts' public school students after they graduate from high school. We learned that 100 kids start ninth grade, let's say. Of that 100, 70 will graduate high school. It used to be 65 before the pandemic, but we relaxed some graduation requirements, so more kids are graduating. Of that 70, 30 will attend college. Used to be 35, but after the pandemic, it declined. And of that 38, 8 will graduate from post-secondary within 6 years. So you start with 100 kids, 8 kids graduate. We know what those 8 kids do because we have national clearinghouse data. The other 92, the best I can tell you is I looked at the American Community Survey. What do young people with no college degree born in DC generally do? They're cashiers. We invest $2 billion a year in education. So that's actually a very disturbing outcome.
You have some really smart cashiers relative to maybe the rest of America.
But far away from opportunity, unfortunately. And that amplifies intergenerational poverty. And it also creates concentrated poverty in the city. And those are the things that are really, really not good outcomes. So our focus on education is sort of looking at the underlying demographics, but also what creates opportunities and allows schools to mix kids of different races and different income levels. The District of Columbia has a lottery because there are so many charter schools, and also a lot of the kids go to DC's public schools that are not neighborhood schools. About 75% of the kids in the District of Columbia do not go to their neighborhood school. That's the degree of choice. It is a lot. And there is a lottery, and the district has this designation. It's for funding purposes. It's called at risk. And at risk kids are kids either their parents are on benefits, SNAP, TANF, food stamps and things like that, or they are foster children, or they're experiencing homelessness, or they are 1 or 2 years behind by the time they hit high school. So we looked at the lottery using both student level data we obtained from the DC agency that runs the lottery and the charter schools that accept these students. And we found that a lot of the kids who are at risk do not even apply in time for the lottery. We modeled a preference for at-risk kids in the lottery to show what the impacts might be. And now this is the second year we have this preference in place. So it's another area where we designed the policy and the government adopted it. And I think one of the unifying sort of themes we have in our policy recommendations is they're never mandatory. So our recommendation was let those charter schools or DC's public schools that are not neighborhood schools adopt this preference if they want to. If they don't want to, they shouldn't be forced to, because not all schools are good at serving kids who fall in this category, right? And we're very pleased that it has been adopted. And now, you kind of see the demographics changing and schools doing a much better job in mixing kids of different races and incomes.
So with all this choice, I guess, is the demand satiated? Is everyone not getting what they want, but...
Yeah, that's a really good question. We saw for the first time enrollment numbers decline in DC during the pandemic, especially in early grades. That's troublesome news because if early grades start declining, the decline will travel through, for 12 years as these kids progress into higher grades. And it was for the first time last year's wait lists were really, really short. But we looked at the lottery applications this year. About 75% of the kids get matched to the schools, at least the school that they listed. The families basically list a bunch of schools saying, we want this, this, this. And the lottery algorithm places them. So that means about three quarters of the kids got in, another quarter are on the wait list. But let me put it this way. Anacostia High School, for example, of all the public school students who live in the catchment area of Anacostia High School, only 20 of them attend that school. The other 80 have exercised choice and are studying elsewhere.
Wait, so speaking of Anacostia, to kind of move away a little bit from the school thing, but obviously this is related because all these people live in DC. Growing up, Anacostia in my mind has always been like, oh, don't go to Anacostia. It's dangerous. So let's talk about the criminal justice system. It's kind of hard to know where to start with this one. Obviously, you want to reduce crime. Well, also, is my stereotype/idea of Anacostia correct?
We did a study on this, looking at exposure to homicides as a proxy for sort of like the concentration of crime. The crime in the city has increased tremendously, and violent crime, especially killings and shootings and things like that. And the certain parts of Ward 7 and 8, which are areas in the east of Anacostia River, have always had significant levels of homicides and crime. So when you look at, for example, exposure that we see to crime, there are kids who probably witness over 350 or 400 homicides within a mile of their homes every year in Anacostia. It's a big number. And it's devastating because it means that these kids don't feel safe. They don't want to go out. They don't want to go to school. They don't want to go to the rec center. So there's a significant increase in crime. And these have always been high crime places. And interestingly, the attitude towards police is very different there than sort of like the defund the police initiatives. There is a great desire for, effective policing, not, racist policing, but effective policing. And the district's police departments are actually pretty good on that front. The criminal justice system in DC is also really interesting. In 1996, the city went bankrupt. It went bankrupt. That's another interesting thing that I learned. Before it went bankrupt, it declared a year with 5 quarters because the revenue wasn't enough to pay for expenditures. So they said, hey, this year we're going to have 5 quarters and we'll take this money from next year and balance our budget. It didn't work.
Five quarters. Quarter means 4 parts.
Yeah. It was 4 parts. Yeah. So this is how bad the financial management was. At the time, under Bill Clinton, the federal government passed a legislation called the Revitalization Act that was designed to improve the city's financial standing. In the process, the feds took over the district criminal justice system. So the only 3 agencies in DC that are working on that are involved in the criminal justice system is the police department, Department of Corrections, which runs the city jail, and then youth rehabilitation, which runs like the juvenile justice system. If you any criminal code offender in DC is a ping pong between the federal and the local system. The police will arrest you. You'll be prosecuted by the U.S. Attorney's Office, which is federal. Police is local. The courts will sentence you. And the pretrial and defender services, these are all federal. Then you'll go to a federal prison, God knows where. And then if you could come out, it's the federal parole board that determines your fate. And then when you come back for supervision, it is still the federal government doing the supervision. And this is a tragic situation. I'll give you an example. Because we don't have a prison, the DC code offenders are under the care of Federal Bureau of Prisons. So when you look at the profile of incarcerated persons in federal prisons, there are basically 2 types of crimes: white-collar crimes and drugs, right? There isn't any sort of homicide, assault. Those are very few. And those are the guys who ate somebody else's head or something. Like, they're in Rikers. They're in these prisons and they're not coming out. They don't have any supervised release. They don't have any of that stuff. They're truly, truly terrible criminals. That's the federal profile. And then, the white-collar crime folks like Martha Stewart, they go to Gucci prisons. That's pretty relaxed. And when you look at the district's incarcerated profile, DC code offenders, young Black people who are in there, mostly male, who are in there for assault, homicide, things like this. So they end up in Rikers with all the other people who have no chance of coming out. So the parole board requires that these folks go through some training or education, anger management, blah, 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 whatever, before they're even eligible for supervised release or parole. But because they're in Rikers and with the head eaters, there are no services available to them. because those prisons, the federal prisoners there, they're not coming out. So there are no classes. There's no return from that prison. So the district's folks are stuck there, even though they should be eligible for supervised release and parole. I mean, to me, this is, yes, they're co-defenders. They've served their sentence, and they should have at least the chance of coming back as someone who committed a similar crime in Virginia or Maryland. So it's a very tragic situation. This is why I don't know if you followed it, but the district rewrote its criminal code, and the federal government, which can actually undo district's laws, had this crazy show, and they rejected the criminal code revision. And the revision was not anything, the Fox News and whatnot made it look like it was a really outrageous thing. One thing that got media's attention was that the sentencing for carjackings were reduced from 40 years to 20. And people thought that was the end of the world. Now, research tells us that the sentence length doesn't really impact criminal behavior. It's the enforcement that really matters. And then more importantly, the judges, who are federal employees, were already doling out sentences that were around 15 to 20 years. So the federal government, the Congress rejected a needed reform for totally partisan reasons, for a system that's under their control, but that's deeply affecting DC residents' lives. And this is an area I kind of learned a lot in the last 4 or 5 years and feel very passionate about.
So I guess, what has the DC Policy Center been doing about that area specifically? What work have you guys done relating to that?
We wrote a long report, basically looking at the experiences of incarcerated residents of DC, the co-defenders, from day one that they're arrested all the way to their return. I mean, interviewed all the federal agencies involved, and we tried to put together as much information as possible to educate people on this situation. So it's out there. It's published last month, I think.
Well, I'll be sure to go check that out. Is there anything that you think, if you could impart one lesson onto to state think tanks or even federal think tanks, things that you've learned through being at the DC Policy Center, what would you say? What would you tell them?
I think it's really important to think of policy in the context of other policy areas. I mean, at the national level, let's say you're doing immigration policy, you can't just do immigration policy. You also have to think about employment, human services, all this stuff, housing, right? So sometimes at the federal level, I don't mean to be critical, and I don't follow all the good work that's happening there, but there is a lot of sort of big thinking, but very parochial in the sense that it's only focused in that issue area and not really considering the ramifications elsewhere. That's one of the things that I see at the federal level. And I think the federal policy change game is entirely different from the local one. So I would not ever want to, provide a recommendation or suggestion there. I feel very inadequate. I think at the state level, what we have found out is, because we've been looking for organizations like us to see what they are doing in their own states, there's a lot of advocacy, but not a whole lot of good research. A lot of these advocacy organizations rely on national research organizations. So there are a bunch of fiscal policy institutes that rely on the Center for Budget Priorities work. They rely on ITAP, CAP, whatever. Or there will be more libertarian ones relying on Cato's work or Manhattan Institute's works and things like that. Institutions matter greatly. And I think that you really sort of have a broad focus, not be a single issue entity, but have a broad focus. It's worth learning these areas because that makes the area you're passionate in, be it housing, be it human services, be it education, be it tax policy, it makes it so much better.
Do you think that the reason why a lot of these smaller, more local think tanks don't do research and stuff like that is kind of because all of the important policy decisions are kind of being taken out of the hands of most local governments and being placed in the hands of, even the federal government. DC kind of is somewhat unique in this sense. Obviously, you just outlined the federal government's power in the criminal justice system to us in pretty much horrific detail. But do you think that like kind of dissolution of federalism has anything to do with that?
I think most advocacy organizations or groups at the local and state level don't do research because they don't believe it matters.
Mm-hmm.
And they're right to some extent. I'll give you an example. The District of Columbia just passed legislation requiring that all buildings that have shiny glass windows replace those because too many birds are dying. And the way that passed, and I called one of the council members and I said, when those birds die, they fall on the head of a homeless person. You should value that more and make this not impose more cost, actually take away costs so we could build more housing and help with this problem. And then his response was, well, I saw too many dead bird pictures and that was it. That's all we needed to see. So I think there's a rational reason why many advocacy organizations go through sort of like this emotional channel. And then everybody will say we're using research and data, but they're not. They're basically lining up people to say the same thing over and over again, which is very effective. So that was the hard part for us and continues to be the hard part, to really recognize that we are trying to counter emotion, which sells really well with research and analysis. And that's why I was mentioning sales matter.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. It's kind of this nice full circle. So I wish we had more time to talk. You guys talk about so many different policy areas, and DC has so many unique, I don't want to say policy areas because obviously everyone kind of deals with the same policy stuff, but you guys are in such a unique position that it's kind of super interesting and informative to talk about. But I have one last question for you. What is one thing that you believed at one time in your life that you later changed your position on, and why?
We talked about this already a little bit. When I started the DC government in 2006, I didn't think that I wanted governments to be inefficient, just like you mentioned. I didn't think that they mattered. I thought that they were a colossal mess. And then the Great Recession happened, right? 6 months after I started, and totally changed my view on, good governance and good governments at the state and local level. They matter greatly.
Once again, I'd like to thank my guest for their time and insight, and I'd like to thank you for listening to the Great Antidote podcast. The Great Antidote is sound engineered by Rich Goyette. If you have any questions, any guests or topic recommendations, please feel free to reach out to me at thegreatantidote@gmail.com. Thank you.